There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a man who spent his entire life performing finally decides to stop. No script, no director, no carefully chosen lighting to soften what he's about to say. Just a man in the last chapter of his life, looking backward across a career built on desire, charm, and the kind of on-screen magnetism that made millions of people fall for him before they ever learned his name. Most men who reach his age begin editing their stories, trimming the complicated parts and polishing the version of themselves they'd prefer to leave behind, but Richard Gere did the opposite. At 76, he opened a door that had been sealed for decades, and what walked through it wasn't scandal, wasn't the raw tabloid confession that Hollywood has always fed on, and wasn't regret in any simple sense of the word. What walked through it was something far more unsettling and far more human. 5 names, 5 women, 5 relationships that never became what they might have been, yet carved into him more deeply than almost anything else in his extraordinary life. And when you understand not just who these women were, but what each of them did to him, how each one cracked open a different part of him he didn't know existed, you'll understand why he kept this buried for so long and why, at 76, the weight of carrying it finally outgrew the risk of letting it go. Julia Roberts entered Richard Gere's world the way certain storms arrive, not with noise, but through a shift in pressure, a change in the atmosphere before the sky does anything visible at all. Cast opposite each other in Pretty Woman, neither of them could have fully anticipated how far that film would travel or how completely it would define their public identities for years to come. The script was workable, the concept commercially sound, but from the first morning of rehearsals, something was operating between them that no producer had budgeted for and no director could claim credit for engineering. Gere was a disciplined actor, trained in the architecture of emotional construction, careful with his preparation and precise with his choices, and Julia dismantled all of that without appearing to try. She brought to every scene a quality of emotional honesty so direct and so unguarded that the performance of emotion became beside the point, and you couldn't stay sheltered behind technique when she was standing in front of you. The moment that permanently sealed it for him happened during a quiet rehearsal, before cameras had been properly positioned and before the pressure of full production had settled on either of them. Sitting across a small restaurant table while they blocked a scene, Julia reached under the table and with one slow and entirely deliberate movement drew the tip of her finger across the palm of his hand. An actor's choice, a method for building the connection that scenes about desire actually require, but the effect on Gere was immediate and not small. He described it later as the moment the rehearsal stopped being a rehearsal, because every technical choice he had organized in advance, every professional distance that experienced actors maintain as necessary self-protection, dissolved in that single quiet gesture. What made Julia specifically dangerous to him wasn't ambition or strategy, or the awareness of her own effect on people. It was warmth, the complete and unconscious generosity she brought into every space she entered, the way she laughed without calculation, touched people's arms while talking to them without thinking about it, and held eye contact in a way that communicated genuine specific interest in you as a human being rather than as a scene partner. For a man surrounded by people who were almost always performing in some register, that quality of authentic presence was profoundly disorienting. One cameraman recalled setting down his equipment mid-rehearsal because the moment felt too private to record. Richard Gere never claimed anything beyond what actually existed, but he admitted, with the honesty that only emerges when a person has finally run out of good reasons to protect themselves from the truth, that if Julia Roberts had ever asked him to step outside everything they had each built around themselves, he would not have paused for a single second before answering yes. Sharon Stone arrived the way a certain kind of woman arrives, not announced and not introduced, but simply present, filling a room in a way that alters everything around her without asking permission. That first encounter across a crowded industry event stayed with Gere with a clarity that decades did nothing to soften. She didn't offer polite Hollywood introductions or professional small talk, just moved through the space with a deliberate, unhurried purposefulness that made everything around her seem slower and less defined. Reaching him, she extended one hand and with slow precision brushed an invisible piece of lint from his shoulder, then smiled. But the smile carried no warmth in the conventional sense, because it was a declaration, not an invitation. She was choosing him, and she needed him to understand that he was being chosen. Gere said in the years afterward that Sharon Stone didn't flirt the way other people flirt, that she hunted, and he meant it as the highest form of admiration he could offer. The intelligence she brought to her professional work was what made her genuinely thrilling, the quality that kept him alert and slightly off balance in ways that nothing had managed before. She could spend an hour in easy, generous conversation with crew members, then walk into a scene and deliver something so precisely calibrated and emotionally dangerous that the room went absolutely still. She improvised dialogue that arrived at the emotional center of a scene before the director had finished processing what she was doing, and she disagreed with creative choices openly and without apology when she believed truth was being traded away for comfort. During a rehearsal that Gere has returned to repeatedly, he was building toward a beat in a scene with the careful, methodical patience he'd spent decades developing, and Sharon closed her hand around his wrist and held it until he looked directly at her. "Don't act," she said quietly and with total authority. "React." No stage direction, no directorial note, just what she saw and what she knew. Those 4 words advanced his understanding of presence inside a scene more than anything he'd absorbed in years of training, and the combination of professional and personal disruption she produced in him created a fascination that has simply never fully settled. Diane Lane didn't alter the pressure of rooms the way Sharon Stone did, and she didn't dissolve defenses with warmth the way Julia Roberts did, and that's precisely what made her so much harder to defend against. What she did was something quieter and more fundamentally unsettling. She listened, not in the performed, professionally courteous way that people in collaborative industries learn to simulate, but with the full, undivided quality of attention that makes the person receiving it feel suddenly and unexpectedly visible. Working opposite her became a sustained exercise in emotional exposure, because the sincerity of her presence made it structurally impossible to take refuge inside performance. Their most significant professional collaboration came in Unfaithful, a film built on the interior architecture of desire and guilt, and the material required both of them to occupy an emotional territory with very little professional distance available. Diane inhabited that territory without hesitation, and there was a rehearsal moment that Gere has described with something that sounds almost like reverence. She was preparing to deliver a scripted line grounded in guilt, but instead she slowed everything down, closed the distance between them, and placed her forehead against his lightly and without preamble. Then she whispered, "Don't answer yet. Let it hurt first." Nobody had written those words. Nobody had asked for them, and they stopped Gere completely, because no actor had ever used silence against him with that specific precision. Working from wounds rather than from craft meant she found the actual location in herself where the feeling lived and operated directly from there, and that distinction was one that Gere, a veteran who had built his reputation on emotional access, found both intoxicating and frightening. During a filmed take, her voice fractured, a genuine unplanned crack, and rather than stepping back to recompose, Gere reached across and took her hand, and Diane let the fracture stay in the air between them. For several seconds that no writer had scripted and no director had requested, something completely real held between them on that set, and Gere has said that his entire career is organized around the pursuit of moments exactly like that one. Michelle Pfeiffer never touched him, and that single fact is what makes her placement on his list so striking and so revealing about the man who compiled it. Every other woman he named had built their hold on him through proximity, through warmth, through the specific intimacy that great screen performance demands. Michelle Pfeiffer built her hold through the complete reversal of all of that, through distance, through a quality of internal organization so complete and so stripped of anything unnecessary that standing in her presence felt less like being desired and more like being accurately read. The moment that unlocked his fascination happened in a casting meeting in the late 80s, when she entered, sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table, and looked at him without smiling, without extending a greeting, without performing any of the small social rituals that smooth over the awkwardness of two strangers meeting. 10 full seconds of unbroken and entirely unreadable eye contact passed before either of them spoke, and Gere lost track of where he was and why. Afterward, he said that she had decoded him entirely in those 10 seconds, that she had located something in him he had never consciously placed on display, and no other actor had ever produced that specific sensation in him before or since. Her process deepened everything. She rehearsed not to memorize but to subtract, removing every note that wasn't completely honest until only the true ones remained, and when she entered a scene she moved through it with a cleanness and economy that made each choice feel like the only choice possible. During a test scene, Gere improvised an emotional beat, stepping outside the scripted moment in search of something more alive, and Michelle didn't counter with a prepared response but instead inhaled visibly, let a small tremor enter her voice and said, "Don't lie to me. Not here." Unscripted, unplanned, simply the truth of where the moment had taken her, and it arrived in Gere harder than any studied intimacy ever had. He told people privately that with Michelle Pfeiffer you don't pursue the person, you pursue the depth behind the stillness, the thing she never quite allows you to reach, and that perpetual, elegant inaccessibility made her the one he found himself thinking about long after every other impression had faded. Sophia Loren sits differently from everyone else on this list, and Gere says so himself without qualification, because the feeling she produced in him doesn't belong in the same category as what the others created. With Julia, there was the danger of genuine warmth, with Sharon the electricity of matched intelligence, with Diane the exposure of shared vulnerability, with Michelle the compulsion of unreachable depth. But with Sophia Loren, there was something he hadn't experienced since he was very young, something he had almost concluded was no longer available to a man who had spent so many years building himself into someone accomplished and self-possessed. There was awe, uncomplicated and total. The moment arrived at a European awards ceremony in the late 80s, when Loren moved toward him through a room full of the most successful people in the world, carrying the effortless Italian grace that had made her one of the most iconic figures in the history of cinema. She reached him, placed her open palm against his cheek, with a softness that managed to be simultaneously maternal and devastating, and said with complete unhurried ease, "You look too serious for a man with eyes like that." Gere stood there and couldn't produce a single word in response. In that moment he was entirely undone, a middle-aged movie star with decades of experience, suddenly reduced by one sentence and one gesture to something much younger and much less armored. What made his admiration permanent wasn't that specific moment, but what he witnessed in her relationship to her own craft across the years that followed. She commanded stillness from everyone around her, didn't push scenes toward manufactured emotional peaks, but simply settled and invited everyone in her orbit to meet her at the level of absolute truth. At a master class they both attended, Sophia told the younger actors in the room that if you don't live with your heart fully open, the camera will always find you out, and Gere carried that sentence through every film he made afterward. He described her effect on a room as gravity, something that drew everything toward it without demand or effort or any visible exertion of will. And then he said the thing that separates her from every other name on his list, the thing that may be the single most honest sentence he has ever spoken publicly about himself. He said he never desired Sophia Loren the way he desired the others, that what he desired was to be worthy of her, and that distinction, the vast and clarifying distance between wanting someone and wanting to deserve their regard, tells you more about who Richard Gere actually is beneath the silver-haired Hollywood legend than anything a camera ever captured.